Hello, and welcome to today's webinar. Warren Berger and Elise Foster on Beautiful Questions in the Classroom, Transforming Classrooms into Cultures of Curiosity and Inquiry. Before we start, just want to let you know that we at Corwin wish health and well-being to all of you, your families, and your communities. In times of uncertainty, experience has taught us that one of the best ways to combat isolation is to remain connected. That is why there will be no disruption to our Monday afternoon webinar series. We are so happy that you took the time to join us today for some professional development with Warren and Elise. Just to let you know, if you have questions for Warren and Elise, please write them in the chat function. Please write them in the chat box and questions will be answered at the end of the webinar. Put questions in chat. Also note, Warren and Elise will ask you some questions during the webinar, and they're asking that you'll answer them in the chat function as well. So you can find the chat function at the bottom of your screen, and you can ask your questions there. Now on to forthcoming webinars. Next slide, please. Thank you. April 20th, Julie Stern, Visible Learning for Social Studies, Designing Student Learning for Conceptual Understanding. May 4th, Beth Cobet and Karen Karp, can you go back, please? Thank you, Strength-Based Mathematics Instruction. May 11th, Benji Howard and Wade Antonio Caldwell, Youth Equity Stewardship, yes. May 18th, Debbie Diller, Simply Stations, Grade 4. What does the rest of the class do during small groups? And June 1, Brian Goodwin, Building a Curious School. Now what I'd like to do is turn the presentation over to Eliza Erickson, editor for Teaching Essentials at Corwin, to introduce today's presenters.
Thank you. Hi, everyone. I am very proud to introduce you to Warren Berger and Elise Foster today. Warren is the creator of AMoreBeautifulQuestion.com and the author of the New York Times bestseller, A More Beautiful Question, and several other books about questioning and design thinking. For years, teachers have translated Warren's work to the classroom to help engage students in inquiry and to ask bigger, more beautiful questions themselves. Warren has now teamed up with Elise Foster to bring us the new Corwin book, Beautiful Questions in the Classroom, to provide educators with classroom-specific strategies and examples for building a culture of curiosity, questioning, and critical thinking. Elise Foster is a leadership coach who has conducted significant research in the field of education. She has found that the #1 key to help leaders be more effective is to ask different questions and lean into curiosity. She holds a master's degree in education from Harvard University, and she's the co-author of The Multiplier Effect, Tapping the Genius Inside Our Schools. In a conversation I had with Warren and Elise last week, they said that questions are the antidote to uncertain times. I know we need that antidote right now more than ever. Today, Warren and Elise will walk through how we can equip students with the tool of questioning to help them deal with uncertainty. Make sure you stay until the end of the webinar because we will be raffling off 3 copies of Warren and Elise's new book, Beautiful Questions in the Classroom, by randomly selecting 3 attendees who participate in the webinar chat. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Warren and Elise.
Thank you, Eliza. I'll be doing the first part of this session. This is Warren, by the way. I'll be doing the first part of this session, and then I'll turn it over to Elise to do the second half. Okay, so first of all, I want to thank everyone for being here, and I know these are pretty challenging times all around the country and around the world, but in a way that makes this topic more appropriate. Questioning is a tool for dealing with uncertainty. You know, it's our ability to question. It's almost like an app that we have that we turn to whenever we're dealing with the unknown. We have to figure out what it all means to us and how we should respond. And what do we know? What do we not know? How can we learn more? So we use questioning to kind of if you think of it as a flashlight, the questioning as a flashlight, it's the tool we use to sort of shine a light out there into the unknown and start to learn more, figure stuff out. I even make the point that, carrying forward that flashlight analogy, that the questions you ask will determine how much light you shine out there into the darkness. If you ask a big, open-ended question, you're shining a broad light out there. If you ask a more pointed, let's say closed-ended question, like a yes or no question, you're shining a more narrow, focused light to try to get some more specific knowledge or information. So it's really important to think about questioning as a tool that way. And it brings up a question for me immediately to ask all of you, which is, as you're dealing with this situation and this crisis, I'm wondering what questions has this prompted you to ask? Maybe about the way you're teaching, or the future of education, or what has this sort of taught us? So I'm curious, I want to put that out there. And as the session goes along, if you think of something that applies to that, please share it with us. Write it into the chat box, and we're going to sort of gather all those questions and maybe talk a little bit about them today, but also talk about them later, and get results to you guys later. So so as you submit that question, if you think of a way that this crisis has prompted a certain question and you want to share it with us, what might be helpful is to just start by saying, the situation or the crisis has caused me to ask this question, or it has caused me to wonder about this question. If you word it that way, we'll understand that this is one of these special questions I'm asking for, as opposed to other questions you may wonder about throughout the session. Okay, so keep that in mind as we go along. Okay, so let me get started on what brought me to this place, and that is this book, A More Beautiful Question, which is now out for about, it's been out for about 5 years, and has done very well with a few different groups and markets. The book, by the way, that kind of the central premise of this whole book is that questions are more powerful than we could ever imagine, in terms of they're the source, or they're often the source of innovation, of new developments, of artistic breakthroughs. So many amazing things begin with someone asking a powerful or a beautiful question. And I felt when I wrote the book that was not appreciated enough. I felt that, we tend to put all the value on answers, and we tend to think that new breakthroughs and ideas come out of someone just coming up with an answer. And we don't appreciate the fact that a lot of it starts with the question. It starts with asking the right question and then working on that question and staying with it. So that was the premise behind the book. The book did well with a few different audiences, a few that responded to it. One of the groups that responded was the business world. And as you'll see in this next slide, the business world, kind of came to this book first because they loved the idea that questions can lead to innovation. And so, they're all companies like Disney, Starbucks, they're really hungry for innovation. So they were really interested in that message. I also found that, government agencies were picking up on the book. I ended up going out to NASA to talk to them. Soon I'll be going to the US Army to talk to them. And they are also interested in how questioning can sort of propel fresh thinking within their own organizations. But I think the group that came to this maybe in the strongest way was educators. They came to this book and really picked up and ran with it. it was funny because the book was never really marketed to educators, but they became probably my biggest group of readers, and a lot of it through word of mouth. And you know what educators I think loved about the book was that it was something they knew already. You know, that questioning was so important and such a key part of the work of education. But I think they really liked the fact that this book was focusing on questioning in a really deep way. And so I got a lot of great reaction from educators, and that eventually led to the new book, the current book, because I talked to Corwin and talked to Elise, my co-author, about it, and you know, we all agreed that these ideas that were in A More Beautiful Question could be adapted and tailored to educators, and that's what we're doing in the new book. And I'll talk a little bit about the new book now, but I want to just clarify that there is a question that is at the center of the whole book. And if I had to boil it all down to one question, it would be this: how might we encourage more student questioning in the classroom? I want to, while this slide, let's leave this slide up for a minute, because I want to focus on two words in particular in this question. One word is student questioning. That's really important. I want to emphasize that this book is much more about student questioning than it is about teachers' questions. You know, I know that teachers' questions are hugely important. I do address them to some extent in the book, but I feel that there is a fair amount of literature out there that helps teachers and educators as they try to craft the best questions in their work. What I feel there's less of is an emphasis on how do you generate student questions? How do you encourage it? And so that was the real focus and that is the real focus of this book. So the other word that I really want to emphasize here is encourage. You'll notice I'm saying encourage rather than say teach. How do we teach students to do more questioning? And the reason I say encourage is because in a way we don't really have to teach young kids to question, because they kind of know how to do it from the time they're 2 years old. In fact, there is research out there that shows that young children are generating tremendous numbers of questions between the ages of 2 and 5. One study put it at 40,000 questions. I've seen even higher numbers than that. But kids are asking tons of questions at 2, 3, 4, 5 years of age. They're asking different types of questions as they progress. And it's a really, really powerful phenomenon that's going on. Interestingly, if you wanted to zero in on one period within that 2 to 5 year age group, I think 4 years old seems to be a really peak time for questioning. And girls are actually, and 1 or 2 of the studies I've seen are actually ahead of the boys in terms of questioning. A 4-year-old girl is the ultimate questioning machine. I saw one study that had showed 4-year-old girls asking 300 questions a day. Just incredible amounts of questioning going on. Boys, of course, not far behind there, because if the 4-year-old girl is asking 300, the 4-year-old boy is probably asking 250. So they're both asking incredible amounts of questions at this young age. Now, what's interesting and maybe a little disturbing is that volume of questioning starts to decline pretty quickly as kids get older and as they're going through school. This has been documented in a couple of studies. It also comes out of a lot of anecdotal research, just talking to teachers, talking to parents, and you do see this steady drop off in questioning that happens. And it's the challenge that many educators are trying to deal with. It's like, what do you do about this? And how do you encourage questioning to continue and maybe even grow? This is not a new phenomenon. If you, and teachers have known about this for a long time. And there's a great quote that comes from an education writer from a number of years ago who said, children enter school as question marks and they leave as periods. So I think the challenge, for us is how do we take those kids who enter school as question marks and make sure they leave as bigger question marks. We don't want them to go from the question mark to the period. So what's causing that? That's an interesting question in itself. What are the obstacles to questioning, or the enemies of questioning? It's something I've thought a lot about in my work, and I have a chapter in the new book dedicated to it. But because I think we have to identify what the forces are working against questioning in order to, overcome those forces or address them. So, so I've thought about a number of factors, and one of the top ones is fear, fear of asking questions in terms of, what if I'm asking the wrong question, right? What if I make myself look stupid by asking a question that people already know the answer to? So this fear factor is really, really a big thing with questioning. Another factor is just simply apathy. The idea of, well, why bother to ask? What does it get me? And I think I think the reason this apathy may exist, or part of the reason it may exist, is because we've always indicated to people that they get rewards based on answers. We don't reward them for the questions they ask. So I think that can generate a feeling of, well, why bother? What's the point? Another factor would be ignorance. This would be another enemy of questioning. And when I talk about ignorance, specifically what I'm talking about here is ignorance of how to ask questions. I said earlier that kids come out of they've almost come out of the womb asking questions, but even though they have this natural ability, there's a lot they don't know about questions. And I think they know they don't know it on a certain level. And so they're wondering, gee, what if I'm asking the question the wrong way? Or what if, what should I ask? I'm not sure what to ask or how to ask it. So there is this problem of not knowing enough about questioning, and never being taught, really, never being taught how to ask a good question. Time is another enemy of questioning. And this is a big one, because as any educator knows, there's only so much time. There's a lot of ground to cover every day. And student questioning takes time, right? So how do you make time for it? How do you find a place for it? And, this is not just a concern in schools. It's a concern for all of us in our lives. Do we make time to slow down and ask ourselves important questions, or are we too busy trying to get stuff done? So I think time is a big factor here. And the last one I'll mention is culture. And culture is a big issue with questioning, because you need to have the right kind of environment and culture for people to feel comfortable asking questions. Students are going to wonder, is this really the right place for me to be asking a question? And the only way we can overcome that is by creating a culture where they don't even worry about that for a minute. They feel like, yes, I'm in a place where people ask questions, and we like that people ask questions, and it's a positive thing. So I think that culture piece is really, really important. And by the way, culture, when we talk about culture, it can extend far beyond the classroom. We could be talking about the society we live in being a culture that doesn't reward questions. We could be talking about kids being in a home environment where maybe questioning is not tolerated, right? But those are things that in the education, as educators, we may not have as much control over, you know, what happens in the home, what happens in the larger society. What educators do have control of is the culture of their own classroom and, you know, the culture of the school. So I think that is where the focus needs to be for educators. And that's what I talk about a lot in the book. Elise and I talk about, you know, what makes a good culture, a welcoming culture for questioning, and how do you develop that? You know, is it on the walls? Is it, you know, in the rules you develop? Is it in the way you talk? Is it in the way you act? It's all of those things, really. And so that's a big, big piece of this conversation. So when we talk about those enemies, we want to talk about how you respond to those enemies and those obstacles. And that is through strategies, you know, and there are a number of strategies featured in the book, but I'll talk about 5 of them. There's 5 key strategies that I talk about in the book. One is about modeling questioning. You know, I think questioning is something you have to model for students. So we talk a lot in the book about, we talk about how teachers should be themselves asking questions in front of the students. And one of the really important points I want to make about that is, you know, if you want your students to be asking curious questions, then you almost need to be asking curious questions yourself to model that behavior for them. You know, because if all you're asking are questions that are, you know, teacher type questions, right? You know, sort of checking up on, you know, do you know the answer to that? You're not modeling the kinds of questions you want students to ask, which are curious questions, questions that seek information, questions that are hungry to know something. So the more you can model that type of curious questioning for students to show them that you're curious about stuff, you know, that you're wondering about stuff yourself, the more you can do that, the better it is for your students. Another factor that we talk about in the book is, or another strategy is the idea of fostering questioning, right? And here's where we get into culture. How do you create a welcome culture of inquiry in the classroom? In the book, we talk about everything from how you set up a classroom in a way that might feel more conducive to curiosity and questioning, the kinds of things you might put in front of students to provoke their curiosity, even the ways you might group students and arrange them to allow them to ask questions of each other. It could be things like putting things on the wall that show that you're appreciating questioning, you're looking for questioning, you're soliciting questioning. You know, you could put things on the wall that show, you know, here are our safety rules for asking questions. You know, any question is a good question. It could be, you know, we accept all kinds of questions. We don't judge them. We don't criticize them. We want questions to go back and forth between students and between the teacher and the students. We want questions to flow in all directions. So there are all kinds of things you can put out there in the environment and in the culture that will signal to students or tell students how we feel about questioning in this classroom, how this environment treats questioning, and how we welcome questioning. We can also celebrate questioning. That's part of creating a great culture and environment. And that's where you get into things like wonder walls, you know, putting great questions up for everyone to see, having a question of the week, you know, any way that we can find to show these questions matter to us. We think they're important. We don't want them to just disappear immediately. We want to show that we value them. So obviously questioning is a big, culture is a big, big piece. Now, the third strategy I want to mention has to do with how do we strengthen questioning, kids' questioning abilities and their habits, their questioning habit. You know, we know that they have this sort of natural ability to ask questions, but the muscle maybe hasn't been developed enough, and in some cases it has atrophied a little bit if they haven't been asking a lot of questions in class. So how do we strengthen that? How do we build it back up? And this is where I think questioning exercises and activities can be really, really important. We try to cover a range of them in the book. One that gets a lot of attention is the QFT, or question formulation technique, which was developed by the Right Question Institute a number of years ago. Elise is going to talk in a little more detail about that. But, you know, the exercises like that one, which really at the core, what they're doing is giving kids permission and a little bit of instruction on how to formulate lots of questions, and really giving them the freedom to do it. And if you give kids the freedom to run with it, with questioning, they will really, they'll really take advantage of that, because students really like asking questions once they get kind of used to it, and once they understand that this is what is expected of them, they can really have fun with it. We're also going to talk about See, Think, Wonder. Elise is going to talk about that a little bit too. But there's lots of exercises and activities that can really strengthen it, encourage it, provoke it, and really get kids asking more and more questions in the classroom. Okay, I want to mention a couple more strategies. This one, next one, has to do with ownership of questions. I think this is a really important concept. The idea that if we can get students to feel that they have some ownership of the questions they think of and the questions they ask, they're more likely to stay with those questions and to take them seriously. And one of the things that some of the exercises try to do is try to get kids to take ownership of their questions. Don't just come up with questions, throw them out there, and then forget about them. But teach kids, well, what can I do with a question once I've thought of it? Can I improve that question? Can I work on it and make it better? And maybe can I even act on that question? Is it something that I can turn into a project? Is it something that I can collaborate with other people on finding an answer? So I think this piece about ownership is really important, and I think it's one of the things that will get students really invested in questioning. If they feel they have something at stake there, they feel that their question is something they can stay with, they can develop, they can do something with it, and they can get something out of it. So ownership is a big, big piece. Okay, the last strategy I want to talk about is championing questioning. And I think here we get into this last part of the book is less about the students in the classroom and more about the educators themselves and the schools and how they can practice and promote better questioning throughout their schools. And I think this is a big, big piece. This is sort of the leadership part of the book. So what we talk about in this part of the book is just, as an educator now and as a leader, you need to be asking better questions as well, along with your students. But we're not really just talking about questions that have to do with the lessons, questions for your students. We're talking about questions that can help you be a better leader and can help you sort of champion this movement towards more questioning in the classroom. So I think we want to go a little deeper on that area, and also on the area of exercises. And so I want to turn this over to Elise at this point, and she's going to talk about those two areas in particular, exercises and the whole leadership piece. So Elise, I hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, Warren. Thanks for getting us all in tune with this idea of questioning in the classroom. And just for a moment before I jump into the exercises, I do want to say thank you to all of the educators who have been stepping up in a really big way to provide distance learning experiences for our students, kind of on a moment's notice. It's because of you that my daughter is engaged and driving her own learning right now, which gives me the privilege to continue working on leadership initiatives with clients and doing more work with this book. So just a big thank you, and kind of a reminder that we need you in this work, and we're very appreciative that you're here. As Warren mentioned, I want to turn our attention a bit more to how we strengthen it, some of the exercises that build question asking muscles. And I'm going to try to turn this toward a little bit of how you might do this virtually in the environment that you're living in right now, as well as tie it back to what might be happening in your classroom. And there are 3 particular exercises that I want to share today. And the first is called See, Think, Wonder. And then we'll talk a little bit about question journaling. And then finally, a little bit more on the question formulation technique. So to start, how do we stimulate curiosity? One of the simplest things that you can try is something called See, Think, Wonder, that is a wonderful thinking routine that comes out of Harvard Project Zero. And it builds on a practice that you undoubtedly already use in your classrooms, the practice of sharing artifacts or objects to provoke student thinking. See, Think, Wonder expands on this practice in 2 ways. And by the way, you might do it by showing a picture like I have on the screen. I imagine as you look at that, you're already seeing things in it, you're making some conclusions, and you're maybe wondering a little bit about it. That's what this practice aims to do. And it not only gets students asking their own questions in the wonder piece, but it also gives you important insights on student understanding. And the practice is just as simple as the title suggests. And you can easily adapt it across subjects. And my belief is you can easily adapt this online using shared documents or in your video chats and those kinds of things, where maybe you put up a picture of an endangered biome, maybe a famous painting, and then you ask students to spend some time just looking at it. And you give them enough time that then you can give them an invitation to take a closer study of it. And then ask them to respond to these 3 prompts. What do they see? Just what they can directly observe. And then move on to what do they think is going on? What are they thinking about this thing they observed? And then finally to what do they wonder? Noting their curiosities. Discussing the responses generally in between each prompt. And even asking students to push it a bit further, perhaps at the think stage, when they give you a nugget, you say, what makes you say that? Or when they offer a question, what makes you ask that? Modeling your own curiosity. Now, these are things that I think you can do in using the chat function. It's a little bit easier when you're doing it in one of your live sessions with your class, if you're able to do that. But it can also easily be done over an email exchange or however it is you're connecting with your students right now. And like I said, normally your students would capture these responses on sticky notes and they'd group the responses and have a conversation about them. And in the end, you get the benefit of learning student interests and what they understand about the topic. And students get practice generating questions. And guess what? Parents can even do this at home with their kids. The second exercise that I want to introduce you to comes to us from Tony Wagner, author of Creating Innovators, among other titles. And he suggested that students begin documenting their curiosities using a question journal. And it is just as simple as it sounds. Students simply write down the questions that are interesting to them. Now, you might be wondering, okay, what do they do with them? Starting out, you might offer students some options. One of those options might have to do with the structure that you provide for them to build the habit, maybe suggesting a number of questions to write each day, or perhaps a number of times to write in the journal each week. And then maybe after a week or two, you and the student can look at the questions, asking students to maybe identify a question that they want to explore further, which turns into an experiment or some form of research. And what we've found, at least with our daughter, is when she's got a real interest in something, she needs very little attention from us to go off and do the thing. And I know that's not the case for every parent, but when kids are genuinely interested, they can do a whole lot more than we than when they're not interested. And you know, a parent can play this role as well. Maybe then expanding even into looking at the questions and looking for patterns. Maybe there's a particular topic that's emerging of interest for this student, or it identifies an area for a lack of understanding. There are lots of ways to get creative using the question journals with students working independently or working collaboratively with their classmates so they can explore their wonders together. The final exercise I'll introduce comes to us, as Warren mentioned, from the Right Question Institute. And interestingly, it was originally designed to support parents to be more engaged in their children's education. Attending to an observation that parents wanted to be involved but struggled to know what questions to ask, Lou Santana and Dan Rothstein created the question formulation technique. And this was actually in response to their own question. What if we could find a way to help parents ask better questions at school meetings? This arose after their initial plan of supplying parents with the questions was insufficient, and they recognized that parents needed some additional support of how do you even formulate and craft your own questions. And as more and more adults were introduced to the QFT, they found most adults asking, like, why didn't I learn this in high school? And that led to an initiative to bring the QFT into the K-12 classroom. And the process itself is straightforward with one simple goal: get kids asking their own questions. You can find instructions and supports to run the process by visiting rightquestion.org. And in fact, the image you see on the screen is the result of my attempt to bring the QFT to my daughter's second grade classroom about 4 years ago. We invited kids to follow these 4 basic rules to produce as many questions as they could about the engineering design process. And while it was fun, I learned a really important lesson about expectations and control. And I think that's probably one of the biggest things as you try to strengthen this in your classroom, as you start to recognize in yourself some of the things that come up for you while you are running a QFT or while you are doing a See, Think, Wonder. What are you noticing in yourself? And what I noticed was, students own the responsibility for creating the questions, and as the facilitator, we own the responsibility for setting the conditions for them to do it well. And my biggest issue was breaking rule number 2 by judging student questions. It's a big no-no for the other students. It's an even bigger no-no for the teacher. And what I found was holding on to my own outcome too tightly interrupted my ability to just welcome questions, even the ones about lions and tigers that seem to have no relevance to the design process. And that's where I was reminded of the importance of my own curiosity about how I was showing up. And then more importantly, trusting the process, which positions students to produce the questions most relevant to their learning needs. And producing questions is just one of the 6 steps. And if I hadn't gotten in the way of it, the other steps were sure to help students make the connections themselves. The first is teachers designing a question focus. And this is the part you get to hold tightly. It serves as the foundation for high quality questions, and your question focus can be anything: a picture, a poem, an artifact, anything except a question. And with the freedom to choose anything, you can see how this can be easily connected to any subject matter. And then students, usually in groups, work to produce questions. And then they take an opportunity to improve their questions. They do this by maybe taking an open question and shifting it to a closed question, or vice versa. And then ultimately, they want to prioritize their questions with respect to the learning outcomes and what are they up to there. And then collectively, you decide on what you're going to do with these questions. And then finally, and perhaps as important as the other steps, is to reflect on the process to reinforce the learning around questions and having students reflect on the overall process. And this is a growing approach that's making its way across the globe. It's used in more and more schools, just like the ones that Warren and a Corwin editor visited when researching the book in Kentucky. They went to observe and view the QFT being done And they've recorded these, and you'll find when the book comes out, you'll have access to links and videos of those sessions so you can see the QFT in action and begin to wonder what it might look like in your classroom. And while this, like many of your other trusted teaching methods, might seem more well-suited to in-person learning, in this new wave of remote learning, we're seeing parents run the QFT with their kids and teachers getting creative using shared documents where students can collectively and collaborate in real time to generate and prioritize questions, which leads to then continued discussions in those documents or in other forms of chatting with students outside the classroom. These just represent just 3 of the many activities and exercises we highlight in the book to cultivate curiosity and inquiry in your students. And this is the kind of cultivation we believe is necessary to develop the next generation of curious leaders. And that's where the final chapter of the book takes us, to questioning and leadership, which in my opinion are really the lifeblood of effective leadership, especially in an uncertain world with many competing priorities and challenges. And this uncertainty for all of us is driving us to seek more information to make sense of things. And guess where we tend to go when we want that information? We head straight to the leader. But in my opinion, that's a false reinforcement that as leaders, our job is to supply answers. Instead, we'd like to suggest that becoming a more curious and questioning leader is the approach that's likely to serve you well in an evolving educational landscape where there are few clear answers, and it seems the solutions get murkier the further we move through this crisis and beyond. It's especially true when you're getting you're getting new guidance just about daily from your local officials and the state officials. That's a lot of pressure on leaders. It's a pressure we can't relieve, but we believe it can be mitigated by offering you some ways to frame up your curiosity to help you become a more questioning leader. And we categorize some of the questions you can ask into these 4 categories: questions that help clarify your sense of purpose and mission, questions that help you enable you to rethink and reinvent what you do, questions that help you help others, and questions that help enable you to enact change. Now, any of these areas might be helpful to you right now, and some of them might actually be out of reach, especially as many of you remain in triage mode. Some of you might be feeling drawn to the rethinking and reinventing, thinking this is a brilliant time to do it in the midst of sudden distance learning. And of course, you are reinventing on the fly. You might even feel the allure of enacting change, the changes in education you've wished to see for a long time, thinking this is just perfect. Or the crisis might have you thrust back into, what are we up to here? What's the mission? What is the purpose of this? Here in this webinar, we want to take a few minutes to focus in on that last section, recognizing that every one of us has been thrown into a new situation on a moment's notice, and there's a pretty high likelihood we could all use a little support, and we may not know how to ask for it or even what to ask for. So we want to focus on those questions that help you help others by giving you some tips and some ways to start to frame those up. Regardless of the focus that you take, there's at least one critical element to keep in mind, and that is to bring a genuine curiosity to the questions you ask. And that may seem obvious, but I find it's harder to do than we'd like it to be. When questions come from a place of judgment or rightness, it can feel like an interrogation to the other person, no matter how well intended. And that sets everyone up for a difficult and likely unproductive conversation. So we'd encourage you to ask questions with curiosity and to receive those questions with curiosity. And this double dose of curiosity is going to help us, especially when many of us are sitting here at the edges of our capability. As we explore questions that help others, it's even more important to strike that right tone so your questions can be met with inspiration rather than confrontation. And one support that we'd like to share as you frame up these helping questions is this mental checklist that was a gift to us from a former FBI agent whose life literally depended on building rapport through questioning. Before making any inquiry, he would wonder to himself these 3 things. Am I seeking their thoughts instead of offering my own? Am I focused on their priorities, not mine? Am I offering them choices and options instead of telling them what to do? These are 3 really fabulous questions to ask yourself to ensure that your focus is on the other person and that you're coming from a place of curiosity, no matter the category of question you're asking. And it is particularly important with respect to these helping kinds of questions. Now, sadly, there is no playbook of perfect questions. However, if you can find yourself and find a way to ask different kinds of questions, you can elicit different kinds of responses and actions. So now might be a great time to think of, what are the questions you've asked so far? And what results have they provided? What's that environment been like with the people that you're asking them of? Chances are you've been asked a lot lately, like, how's it going? How are you doing? We might encourage you to, there's nothing wrong with that question, but we might encourage you to shift it into something a little bit different, like, you know, what are you doing in your remote learning plan that most excites you? Or what are we doing as a leadership team that's most getting in your way? These kinds of questions signal your recognition of the challenging times and your genuine interest in learning and adjusting together. One final thought that I'll leave you with as you're asking questions with an aim and a mission to help others is the importance of tone, especially as our communications move online and we lose out on those in-person cues or that opportunity to just drop by someone's classroom. Prefacing questions with an "I'm curious," or "I was wondering," or "the reason I'm asking is," can take the confrontational edge off of any question. And with many of us really bumping up against our own capacity right now, it's more important than ever. Like I said earlier, a lot of this sounds like common sense, but the evidence suggests there's a really big opportunity for leaders to lean into curiosity, shifting away from having the answers, especially in a time when answers, I mean, we can come by them right now, but the chances of them being right tomorrow, in the time we're living in right now, the odds are not in your favor. So the other thing to keep in mind is it's even harder to lean into that curiosity when we're most stressed. So asking yourself and going through this mental checklist before you engage and you start talking with folks and asking questions can be a really helpful interruption to the system. Now, we started our session inviting you to bring the questions that this crisis has raised for you so far. And there are some amazing questions in the chat. It's really hard to follow all of the great questions there. Some about equity, some about the role of the teacher. What about the reliance we have on brick and mortar buildings for education? What we want to invite you to do now is think a little bit about what you've heard so far. What has been sparked in you? And invite you to write in the chat a question that you'll carry with you. And here, maybe you start with a question I'm carrying forward is, and this is just an opportunity for us to join together in our curiosity. It might be, by the way, the same question you arrived with today, or it might be some new direction or a deeper nuance of your initial question. You can take a minute to type those questions into the chat box, allowing us to be curious together, learning through each other's questions, taking a practice at our own questions if perhaps our question asking muscle's a little out of practice, and living into our questioning superpower, which Warren's going to spend just a little bit more time talking about. So thank you.
Thanks, Elise. We're going to go to questions very soon in a couple minutes, but I just want to end with this is kind of a fun little thing that is in the book, and it's the 8 superpowers of questioning. And this comes out of, you know, students sometimes wondering, well, what's so great about questioning? You know, who cares? So, and, you know, having to answer that question of what's so great about questioning kind of forced us to think about what does it really do for us and what does it do for young people and for students? And there's actually a portion of the chapter explaining each of these powers. But, you know, to sum it up, it's that, you know, questioning can help us solve problems, can help us create new things, It lights up the dark. It's that questioning is that thing I was talking about earlier. It's the flashlight when we don't know what's going on. It helps us dig deep, and that gets into areas like critical thinking. You know, how do we figure out what the real truth is? You know, questioning, asking the right critical thinking questions help you do that. Questioning connects us. This is sometimes people don't appreciate what a great tool questioning is for allowing people to connect with each other and to communicate and to understand each other and to be able to empathize with each other. Questioning can take you to new places, and that gets into that idea of, you know, you can use your question as almost a ticket to exploration. You know, the question is the thing you can pursue when you want to explore something. Questioning gives you a voice. This is really important for students, you know, who sometimes feel like they may feel like they don't have all the answers, right? And they're not being listened to. And through questioning, they can express themselves, they can be heard, and they can have some power. Questioning truly is empowering. And then lastly, questioning can change the world. I mean, I've been writing about that for a while, but if you take those first 7 powers and you put them all together, what you end up with is the power to change the world. I mean, if you can create new things, if you can connect people, if you can solve problems, if you can do all those things, you can change the world. So this is a tool that we're going to be offering this at some point as a poster, hopefully, that can be used in classrooms. But this is something that I think I would love to see educators kind of share these superpowers of questioning with students, just to help them understand how valuable this is for them and how powerful it is and how much fun they can have with it. So, okay, so now I think it would be really remiss if we did not leave time at the end of a questioning session for people's questions. And with that in mind, we're going to try to take a few of them now before we go, and let's see what we've got here.
Yeah, hi Warren and Elise. A lot of questions came in, and there was a lot of consistency across the board. A lot of people would like some more information on how can we provide educational opportunities like this in an online environment while keeping them equitable to all of the students that we teach. There was a lot of questions about equity in this online environment and how what you presented today can support that.
Yeah, that's a great question. I'll take a quick swing at it and then let's see if Elise has any ideas. I think what the first step is to be asking that question and asking it to lots of people and asking it to people who might have the power to influence it. I mean, I think part of what we're talking about here is that, you know, not everyone has the same technological resources available to them. So as we go to remote learning, we're going to have issues of, you know, some people, it's going to work better for some people than others. And I think, you know, I certainly couldn't tell you how to solve some of the technological issues or the issues of inequality that may be at work there. But I do think, and this gets to our section of the book on leadership, I do think that this is where educators can play an important role in championing that question or voicing that question and making sure it's heard by the right people, you know? So I think in terms of getting the resources and getting the, and making sure that remote learning can work fairly for everyone, I think the first step is to take that challenge or that issue to all of the people that can have an effect on that and can help provide more resources and make sure it is more equitable.
Thank
Elise, do you have any thoughts on that?
I'd echo what you'd say, and I think the as much as you can get in touch with those folks that you're most worried about, how do you ask them what they most need right now and figure out an interesting creative solution when chances are part of what they most need right now is just a little bit less to do. And how do you craft a plan together to figure out the most important things that they really do need to do. And I think that's what our experience has been. Teachers are really stepping back and saying, okay, what is the absolute most important thing that we have to achieve by the end of the year? Yes, we have all these things we want to achieve, but what's most important to make sure they are ready for grade level next year, and crafting that plan together, which sadly takes more time. But I think asking those folks what their recommendations are is probably a really great starting point.
Thank you. I have another question. How can we engage and connect with our youngest learners using what you presented today? We feel so far away from them right now during distance learning. How can we engage them?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think this whole idea of the distance learning, I think it's going to challenge teachers, educators to be really resourceful. And that's why I think, in a way, the questioning, the idea of asking yourself challenging questions, asking questions the way an innovator would, the way an inventor would, is something that educators are going to be almost forced to do more than ever now, right? Because suddenly all educators are put in the position of having to be an innovator, right? I mean, they have to figure out almost on the fly, how are we going to do this new thing that we haven't done before? And how are we going to work out all the kinks and all the problems? So I think what I would say is the most important thing is to go into this challenge the way an innovator would, which is with a wide open mind, a willingness to experiment, a willingness to learn and listen, because we're all in areas where we aren't quite familiar with what's going on, much like an innovator is oftentimes when they're trying to sort of invent something new. So we have to embrace those kinds of mindsets and those kinds of behaviors that a questioner and an innovator would. And we're going to have to figure out a lot of this stuff for ourselves based on seeing what works and what doesn't work, what young students respond to and what they don't respond to. And there's going to be a lot of experimentation going on. And I think that's, in some ways, that's a great thing.
Yeah, and Warren, I'll add to that, the experimentation piece. I think there are two things popping up for me. And one is, I think, being explicit with parents about the questions that you're up to, modeling that for them and saying, look, we are trying to figure this out and we are running experiments, and something that happens when you run experiments is they go badly. How do we learn through this together and almost expect that we're going to fail in some of these experiments, but we're failing with the purpose of learning through them.
Terrific. That brings us to the end of the questions right now. I know that I will send you all the other questions that were asked, and that you're going to put together some information for everyone when they receive their video and their professional development certificate at the end of the week. So now what I'd like to do is turn it over to Margaret O'Connor, Senior Marketing Manager for Corwin, to talk about some marketing opportunities.
Thank you, Jeff. And a big thank you to Warren and Elise. That was simply wonderful. And especially in these uncertain times, questions really are a powerful instructional tool. You will all be receiving an email with a recording of this webinar, as well as a copy of the PowerPoint slides. Just a reminder that Warren and Elise's new book, Beautiful Questions in the Classroom, will be hot off the press next week. You can get your copy on corwin.com with a 20% everyday educator discount. And if you use the shipping code TESHIP, you can also get free shipping. Our chat box was so engaging, and thank you everyone for your input and your participation tonight. The 3 lucky random winners of a copy of A Beautiful Question in the Classroom are Christine Pavlinick, Angelique Thomas, and Rachel Watson. And we will be getting in touch with you to get those books out to you. And thank you everyone again for joining us tonight, and especially to Warren and Elise.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. It's great to talk to everyone.